Hey everyone, this is James from Brewing Books. So a short while back I was visiting Oxford in the UK to attend Oxonmoot 2022, in which people passionate about Tolkien come from all over the world and gather in Oxford to discuss the works of the professor, to organize activities, present talks, and various sorts of other activities. And this was the second time I attended Oxonmoot to present my own paper. And I decided to record my presentation for anyone who might be interested in learning what it was all about. So please enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. A warm welcome also to people attending online. So my name is James. A very brief introduction about myself. I love tea, I love beer, and obviously Tolkien as well. But I also love to read and write. In fact, recently I published a number of short stories on Sherlock Holmes, and I also wrote a 4,000-verse poem on the Battle of Hastings. So that's just a very brief introduction. And for people who are interested, I also have a YouTube channel which is entitled Brewing Books. It's about reviewing books, especially on Tolkien. So today, as has already been said, I will be presenting a talk entitled Druid Castles and Vampiric Villains, the Liminal Gothic in Tolkien's tale of Beren and Lúthien. So first off, the term Gothic. It's a strange, powerful word. And the third definition given by Collins Dictionary is that of being a literary subgenre that deals predominantly with the supernatural and the grotesque. And it was a style made popular towards the end of the 18th century. And if we delve deeper into this particular subgenre, one finds references to the macabre with elements of horror, death, psychosexual themes, and also mystery. Indeed, who doesn't love a well-crafted Gothic mystery? Even avid readers of historical fiction, thrillers, or romance who may normally recoil in distaste at anything which is remotely ghostly or morbid cannot resist the allure of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, or even the seemingly innocent or even warm-hearted narrative of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Those aspects of the inhuman and the bizarre seep through the Gothic style unlike anything else in literature. And Gothic stories channel our deepest desires, thoughts, and concerns. And they bring out what we fear or crave the most through bleak settings and supernatural beings that inhabit those stories. It would also be a serious oversight if we fail to mention the most famous and widely known of supernatural Gothic villains, Count Dracula. So Bram Stoker's timeless novel brought the figure of the vampire back from the shadows and redefined our modern conception of the blood-sucking creature. And while the subject of vampires will feature somewhat prominently in this discussion, we are here to talk about Tolkien. More specifically, a specific chapter in the published version of the Silmarillion, so the 19th chapter of Beren and Lúthien, is one of the crucial narratives that propels the story of the Silmarillion towards its devastating conclusion. It is a convoluted tale of love, loss, despair, grief, and salvation. It can also be interpreted as a story that assumes quite a number of themes and motifs from Gothic, and that is the aim of this discussion. So what we can learn from the 19th chapter of the Silmarillion is almost a summarized version of what Tolkien had intended the tale to be. Indeed, this story exists in different formats and stages of development, especially the Lay of Luthien, the poetic version of the tale. So the story itself is spread across different texts and formats which span several decades. However, although plot lines and motifs might have changed from one text to the other, the core elements of the story itself have remained unchanged. And in the tale of Beren and Lúthien, the sequence, in my opinion, that evokes the most powerful Gothic elements takes place during Beren's captivity by Sauron in the Isle of Werewolves. Now, narratives within the Gothic often deal with ancestral curses, a character's obsessions, madness, and ambitions. Visually, the text is emphasized by horror with depictions of blood, terror, claustrophobia, and the abject. And Gothic stories also tend to explore strange places and exotic landscapes, with an archaic world that tends to be dangerous, which often makes our protagonist a prisoner in that world. And the castle is the most common form this archaic world takes shape in. So castles that presumably once offered warmth, revelry, or at least security stand empty and ruined, providing instead baffling passageways, unspeakable mysteries, and menacing or pathetic apparitions. So the concept of a fallen, decrepit, corrupted place that was once beautiful and attractive is at the heart of the Gothic. And within the tale of Beren and Lúthien, this is best exemplified in the Isle of Werewolves. And of its origin, Tolkien writes, "He, Sauron, took Minas Tirith by assault, for a dark cloud of fear fell upon those that defended it. Then Sauron made it into a stronghold of evil and a menace." So what was once a strong fortress of the elves is now an evil stronghold filled with dungeons, terror, wolves, and as we see later on, vampires. Now, a relationship exists in Gothic stories that juxtaposes the modern world with the past. So the past invades the present and destabilizes it. A typical example would be the presence of a ghost, in which a thing of the past, in this case someone who has supposedly long been dead, shows up in the present. It is this interplay between space and time, geography and surroundings, the physical and spiritual, that is at the heart of the Gothic. And the most evident example of this in Tolkien's tale is the tragic character of Gorlim. So one of the outlaw companions of Beren, at the beginning of the story, he is captured by Sauron and killed. Later on, Beren is visited by Gorlim in a dream, which makes for a very evocative sense of the dark, macabre world of Gothic. So as he slept benighted in the forest, he dreamed that carrion birds sat thick as leaves upon bare trees beside a mere, and blood dripped from their beaks. Then Beren was aware in his dream of a form, and it was a wraith of Gorlim, and it spoke to him, declaring his treachery and death. Now, Tolkien's prowess at evoking atmosphere, especially the dark, horrid descriptions of landscapes and tormented individuals, in my opinion, is most effective in his verse. In fact, in the poetic version of the tale, the Lay of Lúthien, we get a stronger sense of Tolkien's word choice and expression for the Gothic and the macabre, and even more gruesome depictions of death. And in fact, the same episode with Gorlim visiting Beren in a dream is also replicated in the poetic version. In his sleep, he felt a dreadful darkness creep upon his heart, and thought the trees were bare and bent in mournful breeze. No leaves they had, but ravens dark, set thick as leaves on bough and bark, and croaked, and as they croaked, each neb let fall a gout of blood. And a web unseen entwined him hand and limb, until worn out upon the rim of stagnant pool, he lay and shivered. There saw he that a shadow quivered far out upon the water wan, and grew to a faint form thereon, that glided over the silent lake, and coming slowly softly spake. Not to mention another episode in the poetic version in which Beren and Lúthien enter the fortress of Angband and stumble upon the throne room of the Dark Lord himself. And once again, Tolkien's prowess in verse comes out really strongly. Until at last, in that huge gloom, heavy as overhanging doom, that weighs on Tongarodrim's foot like thunder at the mountain's root, they came as to sombre court, walled with great towers, fort on fort of cliffs embattled, to that last plain that opens abysmal and inane, before the final topless wall of Bauglir's immeasurable hall, where under looming awful waits the gigantic shadow of his gates. Now, in the Silmarillion, Tolkien also describes Beren's escape from Sauron's captivity and his journey into the wild in a few words, but the sparing use of language and his mastery of it is enough to convey vivid and visceral visuals of our character's plight, including this exotic and archaic landscape we discussed. So all that land was now become filled with evil, terrible was his southward journey. Beyond lay the wilderness of Dungorteb, where the sorcery of Sauron and the power of Melian came together, and horror and madness walked. That journey is not accounted least among the great deeds of Beren, but he spoke to it of no one after, lest the horror return in his mind. Now, this idea of phantoms, ghosts, and specters is closely linked to another Gothic motif that presents itself in the genre. And in fact, according to the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, the Gothic provides the best-known examples of those strange and ghostly figures that Freud saw as examples of the uncanny. The deeply and internally familiar as it reappears to us in seemingly external, repellent, and unfamiliar forms. So the uncanny, as described by psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, is something familiar and established in the mind, but has certain peculiar qualities. It disturbs the mind beyond comprehension and makes the beholder or reader feel uneasy, even though we are unaware of the cause. So the uncanny conjures these odd sensations when we know of the thing before us, but not in the way it is being presented in that context. And the most obvious example of this are figures that look human but are not, for instance, waxworks, dolls, etc. So monsters and creatures can also be categorized under the term uncanny. And Sigmund Freud himself said, Gothic monsters are displaced and distorted versions not only of tendencies repressed across culture, but also of the bad subject, the other, with whom those tendencies have already been identified and who has already been labeled monstrous. So werewolves and vampires embody most of what can be termed as Gothic. These creatures are neither human nor monsters, and yet they are both. They can shapeshift, transform, and terrify. These beings are liminal bodies, as we say, bodies that occupy the threshold between the two terms of an opposition, like human-beast, male-female, or civilized-primitive. And the tale of Beren and Lúthien is replete with monsters and other dark, horrifying creatures. But the most salient of these occurred during the Isle of Werewolves episode, once again. So after the conflict between Sauron and the great hound of Valinor, Huan, Tolkien writes that immediately he took the form of a vampire, great as a dark cloud across the moon. And he fled, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees, and came to Tar Nufuin, and dwelt there, filling it with horror. So this very specific image of Sauron shape-shifting captures the essence of the Gothic. His escape is undeniably atmospheric, with the blood on the throat and the moon shrouded in darkness in the background. Now, later on, Beren himself falls victim to the effects of the uncanny, which can cause on the mind of a character in a Gothic tale. So as Luthien casts a spell that enables both herself and Beren to transform into a bat and a wolf respectively, Beren is struck by terror at his lover's transformation, and horror was in his glance as he saw upon his flank a bat-like creature clinging with creased wings. And the narrative behind the tale of Beren and Lúthien is propelled forward by Tolkien's use of shape-shifting characters, basically when an individual becomes something or someone else. And this shift in identity and the loss of the self can be gleaned in many Gothic tales. That sense of revulsion at something or somebody you know is at the heart of what makes a tale truly Gothic. And in Tolkien's writing, we find further examples of characters who shapeshift or transform into creatures or beings other than their own natural form. For instance, the elf lord Finrod Felagund, at an earlier stage in the story, uses his skill to change his own and his companions' forms, as Tolkien says, into the likeness of orcs. Later on, Sauron took upon himself the form of a werewolf, from wolf to serpent and from monster to his own accustomed form. And the motif of the uncanny is so intrinsically linked with Gothic fiction and almost everything it embodies, and it can be best exemplified through the character of a vampire. Now, treading carefully on this specific issue, Tolkien references the word vampire a few times in his body of work, and almost in enigmatic terms. So, for instance, in The Hobbit, during the Battle of Five Armies, we are told how the great bats swirled about the heads and ears of elves and men, or fastened vampire-like on the stricken. In the chapter of Beren and Lúthien, Sauron and his servant Turin-Gweithil are both described as assuming shapes of bats with vampiric characteristics. Now, bats have been associated with witches and demons for centuries, but it was Stoker's novel which associated these flying mammals with vampires. Later on in the tale, as Beren and Lúthien disguise themselves to approach unhindered the fortress of Morgoth, the elf maiden assumes the shape of Thuringwethil, an obscure character only mentioned this one time. So she was the messenger of Sauron and was wont to fly in vampire's form to Angband, and her great fingered wings were barbed at each joint and with an iron claw. So considering all of this, the term vampire used by Tolkien may well have been a synonym for a bat, and in fact the real-world vampire bat is testament of this shared link between the mammal and the mythological figure. Now, a recognizable trait of the vampire is the sucking of blood from its victim. A kind of metaphorical vampirism, which again is a common element in Gothic fiction, can be gleaned in the tale of Beren and Lúthien. Several times, characters faint or swoon in the presence of another individual, as if their life, soul, or consciousness are being sucked out, as it were, just like a vampire preys on its victims. Now, a rather powerful image, in my opinion, that conveys this idea occurs during Beren and Lúthien's encounter with Morgoth in his fortress. So before the throne room, with all his court cast down in slumber, as Tolkien says, the elf confronts the Dark Lord. Then Lúthien, catching up her winged robe, sprang into the air, and her voice came dropping down like rain into pools, profound and dark. She cast her cloak before his eyes and set upon him a dream, dark as the outer void where once he walked alone. It is this very image which is very much reminiscent of a vampire closing in on its prey and leaving the victim helpless and devoid of life or strength. Now, another motif in Gothic is that of power. And while the passive agent of terror is the castle, the active agent of terror is the Gothic villain. And the dominance of a character over another, or the struggle between the supernatural and the human, is another exemplary characteristic of the Gothic genre. In Victorian novels, for instance, this is typically exemplified by the character of a vulnerable woman being pitted against villains and transgressors, such as the character of Lucy Westenra in Dracula. And this concept of power plays an important role in exploring the limits of being human and the clash between the natural and the otherworldly. In a recent article, The Significance of Female Identity Within Gothic Literature, author Angela Carter states, there are two main female roles within Gothic literature, the predator and the victim. The first is dangerous, yet powerfully attractive. She helps portray the pain-pleasure paradox that has come to be synonymous with the Gothic literature. The latter is fragile and vulnerable. She gives the heroes something to rescue and is often the prize for their brave endeavors. What is interesting in Tolkien's tale is almost the reversal of this concept. While Lúthien finds herself in dire straits during particular moments in the story, it is the elf maiden who comes to the fore to save the day. At a particular point in the narrative, Lúthien is locked in a tower by her own father. The motif of imprisonment as a means of manifesting female repression is also a common technique in Gothic fiction. So contrary to this damsel in distress concept in need of saving, in reality, Lúthien ends up saving herself through her own prowess and motivations. To a certain extent, Tolkien's tale threads subtly also on another important motif in Gothic fiction, sexual power. So themes of repression, desire, perversion, vulnerability, they impose themselves on much of the literature. And the male-dominated world comes to the fore, while the seemingly frail female is repressed and enclosed in her virtuous goodwill and true morale. However, in Tolkien's story, Lúthien is far from the daunted or controlled and idle character. This is once again reflected in Morgoth's throne room episode. So as the entire fortress, along with Beren himself, fall deep in slumber by the enchanting power of the elf maiden, Morgoth assumes the characteristic attitude that defines the Gothic villain, with all his rage and violence, and above all else his masculine power. Then Morgoth, looking upon her beauty, conceived in his thought an evil lust, and a design more dark than any that had yet come into his heart since he fled from Valinor. Thus he was beguiled by his own malice, for he watched her, leaving her free for a while, and taking secret pleasure in his thought. Yet again, the stark difference between some established Gothic tropes of the late 19th century and Tolkien's writing is that it is Luthien, the seemingly fragile and helpless female, who emerges victorious out of this confrontation. Now, curses and prophecies are also essential concepts in the development and formation of Gothic literature. Through them, the narrative introduces foreshadowing early in the story, which eventually plays out towards the climax of the plot. And this is typified in the entire storyline of the Silmarillion through the prophecy of the North, or the Curse of Mandos, in which the angelic power of the Vala condemns those Noldorin elves for disobeying and failing to repent the kinslaying. And as the events in the Silmarillion unfold and the elf Feanor ignores such warning, he and all his exiled followers find themselves bound by this curse. And as Tolkien writes, the Silmaril are cursed with an oath of hatred, and he that even names them in desire moves a great power from slumber. And the entire framework of the Silmarillion is rooted in the curse of Feanor's Silmaril jewels, which has deep consequences also in the tale of Beren Lúthien. Tolkien writes how the elf Thingol challenges Beren for the hand of his daughter Luthien by demanding a Silmaril be rescued from the Dark Lord. And Tolkien says, thus he, Thingol, wrought the doom of Doriath and was ensnared within the curse of Mandos. Now, a critical part of what makes Gothic fiction so effective and evocative in its portrayal of characters' inner turmoils and conflicts is the use of the sublime, a fascination of or with dangerous situations. And the Romanticism movement towards the end of the 18th century aimed at beautifying nature and the natural surroundings to inspire awe and wonder. On the contrary, the sublime in the Gothic creates a terrifying landscape that nonetheless instills a sense of awe and overwhelming dread to the characters that experience it. Besides reflecting individuals' state of being, their fears and traumas, it also allows readers to experience and understand the world they find themselves in. And once again, in the Lay of Luthien offers several lines of verse to describe and evoke those feelings of dread, terror, and awe. A case in point is this extract concerning the description of Morgoth's throne room. The pillars, reared like monstrous shores to bear earth's overwhelming floors, were devil-carven, shaped with skill, such as unholy dreams doth fill. They towered like trees into the air, whose trunks are rooted in despair, whose shade is death, whose fruit is bane, whose bows like serpents wreathe in pain. Now, ultimately, it seems that the only escape from the Gothic world is death. And having escaped the horrors of Morgoth's fortress, the narrative reaches its climax with the death of our two characters. Released, as it were, from the cruel and unforgiving perils of the mortal world, it is once again the humble and pure figure of Luthien who moves the great powers of the Valar and Iluvatar into granting her and Beren a second life, as it were, back on mortal shores. Now, despite the perceptible Gothic motifs present in the tale of Beren and Lúthien, it can be safely concluded that Tolkien did not intentionally set out to write a Gothic tale. As he himself wrote to editor Milton Waldman in 1951, as such, the story is, I think, a beautiful and powerful heroic fairy romance. Through the story, he could explore and emphasize the importance of the apparent weak individual overcoming impossible odds, such as the same concept was used in The Lord of the Rings, where the seemingly feeble race of the hobbits defy and overcome the Dark Lord. Now, Tolkien may not have set out to write a Gothic-influenced story or long poem, but it certainly appears to be a subconscious decision to add many elements and motifs to his narrative. It is also tempting to think how Tolkien may have been influenced by the literature at the time, and perhaps the powerful aesthetics of the Gothic seeped through his imaginative subconscious, which aided him in the creation of the atmospheric qualities and characterful attitudes that are so prevalent in the Gothic. Thank you very much.